Hello and welcome to First Edition Live, which is where we try to turn an early morning newsletter into an early evening discussion without completely ruining our body clocks in the process. I'm Archie Bland, I'm the editor of First Edition, which is our weekday newsletter, goes out every day at 7 a.m. and please do subscribe to it at theguardian.com/firstedition. And I'm here with Nimo Omer, who's our assistant editor. How are you doing, Nimo? Are you feeling wide awake and energetic after a very long day?
Absolutely. So many coffees. I'm awake, I'm alert, I'm ready for this next hour. So just to quickly explain what exactly we're doing here. Every month, Archie and I will take one big story and discuss it with people who know far more about it than we do, so that we can come away from this conversation with a better understanding of the topic than we had at the start of the conversation. And hopefully you will as well.
So for today's first edition of First Edition Live, we are talking about the state of the Conservative Party, which is obviously pretty difficult to get away from as one of the big domestic issues of the moment. We have had months, and actually it feels like several centuries at this point, of controversy over Boris Johnson and Partygate. That came to a head in some sort of way with a vote of no confidence where 41% of his own MPs voted against him, but things have certainly moved on since then as well. And the big stories this week have been the Northern Ireland Protocol, refugee flights to Rwanda, the resignation of Lord Geit. It always seems like there is something going on. The big question coming out of all of this is whether the page has turned on that crisis and whether Boris Johnson's survival is now, at least for the time being, priced in, and whether that's a good thing for his party or not.
So, loosely speaking, we're going to break this story into three parts. You know, how this crisis has been playing out in Downing Street, how it's been playing out among MPs, and how it's been playing across the country. And to do that, we're really happy today to be joined by Salma Shah, former advisor to Sajid Javid. Welcome, Salma.
Hello, nice to be here.
As well as Guardian columnist Gaby Hinsliff. Welcome, Gaby.
Everybody.
So we're going to begin, and thank you both very much for joining us for the first time. Sorry if we do anything technically dodgy because we are very new to it, so apologies in advance. But we want to start by trying to give people watching a sense of how it feels to be on the inside of a crisis like this and a sense of what is going on within Downing Street. So Salma, I wonder if I could start with you. We'll begin with the no confidence vote, but certainly move on from that. Losing the support of 2 in 5 of your own MPs looks like a very painful position to be in. From the outside, it seems like a disaster. Can you just talk about what it's like being inside the goldfish bowl when your boss has found himself in a bit of a crisis, as I guess must at some point have happened in your time in working with Sajid Javid?
Oh, no, I was the perfect special advisor, so obviously had no crises ever to deal with. So I think the first thing to remember is that the complexions of different iterations of governments changed the reaction to it. So if this had happened under a Cameron scenario, then you probably would have ended up with a very well-established small group of people gaming through what they were going to do. In Theresa May's era, where this has happened, it was a long time coming. You sort of knew what was going to happen. You sort of knew the fact that she was going to go. It was a question of when. And so it was really kind of managing the decline at that point. And I think this iteration is a lot more chaotic, not least because everybody there is very new and actually not well versed in, you know, the usual machinations of what happens in government. And that's not only true for the political people there, because obviously we know that we've had, 3 chiefs of staff now in number 10 over the past 2 years. But also true for the officials that are there. So Simon Case, the permanent secretary, is actually incredibly new. There's a new private secretary, principal private secretary after Partygate. So bearing that in mind, what then unfolds? Largely, in this case, I think it's panic because they weren't actually connected with what was happening in the Whip's office. They didn't expect it to happen. It happens just as we're coming out of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee weekend. And so I think it's a sense of sort of incredulity, slight disbelief, a bit of panic, and then again just waiting to see what happens. And they're not moving, so none of us move either.
And Gaby, how do you rate this iteration of the Downing Street operation against the many it's probably quite hard to keep up, but what's your sense of how it's been running in the last few months?
I mean, it is just degrees of chaos, isn't it? Ever advancing degrees of chaos. But I think what surprised or not surprised me actually about about this time is that, the situation that Sam was described, he's absolutely right. They didn't expect the sort of the number of MPs voting against him to be so high. And for a lot of prime ministers, that would be a pretty chastening experience. I mean, if you think about it on a human level, 148 people are the people who know you best, the people who work with you, the people whose lives are going to be absolutely chucked up in the air if you resign. Don't like you, don't think you're fit for office. I mean, that's not just like, oh, we're not that happy, we'd like a change, like to go somewhere different for lunch. It is literally, you are not fit to occupy the highest office in the land. And that's a huge thing. It's a big hurdle to cross to say that about a sitting prime minister. You're saying this is a person that the people elected, but we're going to kick you out. That's quite a big Rubicon to cross. So for 148 MPs to go merrily across it, for a lot of prime ministers, that would be a bit of a moment where you might, consider your life choices and whether you've made them wisely. But this one just seems to go from kind of bad to what, there is no holding back. It is straight into, they kind of lurch into this, very tried and tested reaction. Well, let's just sort of throw some red meat off the back of the sledge and let's start a fight about refugees again, and let's start a fight about Brexit again, which is a very tried and tested reaction. But it makes no sense if you look at what actually happened in that confidence vote. The MPs who were probably most unhappy with Boris Johnson, it did come from all over, so this is a sweeping generalisation. The ones that are probably most unhappy and most organised are the One Nation MPs, your old school, Remainery, bit wet, would like to just get back to being normal Conservatives. They're the ones who are most unhappy. And you had this initial thing in the aftermath of all of, I think people probably remember talking about Waitrose woman, must get Waitrose woman back, who's just sort of Remain voting, sorry, Tory, who just thinks it's all got a bit distasteful. So fine, if that's your strategy, then they've done completely the opposite. The last thing Waitrose woman wants to hear about, and the last thing you want to hear about if you're a sort of home counties MP worried that, you're going to lose Guildford, is sort of, a massive trade war with Europe and a load of really right-wing stuff. So it makes no sense as a strategy. It is literally kind of just lunging around to try and find, something that will get you off the immediate hook. At least we're having a row about something else, although it's not as if, either of these policies are going particularly well at the moment, but at least we're having an argument about something going wrong other than the Prime Minister going wrong, I suppose.
Yeah, and despite this quite fraught image that you've just painted, Boris Johnson has continued to kind of trying to come out swinging, and the government's talking points have tried to present that this is like a result. This result has been a huge success. I heard Dominic Raab this morning reiterating that the Prime Minister had the support of 59% of his own MPs, like that was some kind of triumph. So, Gaby, is your sense that Johnson's inner circle really believe that this is actually a good result, or how strong is that Kool-Aid in Downing Street?
I think it's very day to day. I think it's we survived today. We're still coming in the morning. We're in jobs till the weekend. That's winning. I don't think there's necessarily a sense that there's a sort of 2-year strategy for a comeback planned from here. I don't get that feeling. But it's get through today. Whatever you can do to get through today, and then tomorrow's another day. And Johnson has a great belief in, and it has happened for him in the past. He has a great belief that something will turn up. If you just keep at it long enough and weather it long enough, something will come around the corner and it could turn out to play in your favour. And that has happened in the past. There's a sort of mad throw everything in the wall and see what sticks strategy. It has been known to work for him in the first place. I think he's very lucky in the timing of that confidence vote, because obviously you've got by-elections. This was meant to be the quiet week before next week's by-elections when, would not be too many obvious dramas before 2 by-elections they're expecting to lose next week. And he's very lucky to have that confidence vote when he did. Had it come a couple of weeks later after the by-elections, after Lord Geit's resignation, which really says to Tory MPs that this stuff is going to keep on coming. Just when you think you've put the sleazy stuff behind you, there's always something else. There's always something government's going to do to put it in hot water. Only 32 MPs have to flip and vote the other way.
Well, and can I ask, actually, Salma, can I ask you about that? One of the things that strikes me as really interesting about the difficulties that follow from that vote is that if you don't know who voted against you, you're going to try presumably quite hard to figure out who those people were so that you can organise, and that would be true on both sides of this. I had an interesting conversation with Theresa May's former special advisor Gavin Barwell last week, where he was talking about some of the ways that you try to figure those things out, like by getting people to sort of talk almost undercover to them as if they are not canvassing to find out which side people are on. But I wonder if you have a sense of the kinds of things that people in number 10 will be trying to do to figure out who is genuinely with them and who isn't.
So if they don't know that already, then that is a massive problem. And I think one of the issues is that they didn't know that. So the way that you find out when you're Prime Minister and you're number 10 is that you use the Whip's office and the Whip's network. And I think throughout everything, those mini institutions that exist within each of the parliamentary parties, and in this case, the Conservative Parliamentary Party has broken down slightly. So you would have your whips going out, basically gathering information, thinking about, who might be wavering, who's come to them with a complaint, who's got a few issues, who wants to be promoted, blah, blah, blah. And then you have what you call outriders, which is what Gavin Barwell would have been talking about. And those people who are basically sort of pretending that they're just, canvassing opinion for their own decision making. And that then all is fed into sort of one pot and then presented to the Prime Minister. I think the other thing that's sort of difficult here is that there doesn't seem to be that parliamentary political angle, and that that relationship doesn't seem to be strong anymore between Boris and the facets of the parliamentary institutions that exist. We've had lots of iterations, again, of chief whips, and that is really problematic because they need to get to know the flock. And they don't at the moment. So, I think the reason that they were off by a big margin, because, the briefing that was coming out was saying, if it's less than 100, he'll be fine. The reason that was off is that I don't think they really truly understand the extent to which people are annoyed. And again, that is because they don't really know what's happening.
And so, what else do you see them doing that is meant to shore up their support amongst backbenchers? Like, what else can they even do? This is to either one of you, Gaby or Salma.
We're already seeing evidence of it, right? Gaby's just alluded to it. They're throwing the red meat and seeing what sticks. So it'll be. So I don't think the Rwanda refugee policy is entirely designed for that. I think that was always a problem, and because they've gotten desperate, they're coming up with sort of crazier and crazier solutions to it. That does have some net benefit to some of the people that they think they are trying to appeal to, and so. Again, they're doing what all politicians do, or all cliques in politics do, which is they're going through their usual playbook. David Cameron in the Brexit referendum went through the same thing that he did in the Scottish referendum. So he did this playbook and the same thing that he did in the 2015 general election. And he didn't actually understand that the world had changed. And I think what's happening here is that Boris Johnson is doing the exact same thing. So they're throwing things out on the Northern Irish Protocol and saying they're going to be tough and they really are going to sort of respect the union and they cannot have a border in the Irish Sea. It's not really working, which is legitimate, but of course some of the language is problematic. And they're going through this usual playbook, not realising that actually everybody else has moved on.
Gaby, is that your sense? I mean, clearly, obviously, something like the Rwanda policy has been coming for a very long time, as you say. But is your sense in some of the fallout from that, like around the European Court and that sort of stuff, is that deliberately designed to try to improve their kind of...
I don't think this has played out in the way that they expected it to. I mean, it has in some senses. The flight was always planned for this week, which just happens to be ahead of the by-elections, just by coincidence. I think the thinking was always, there are going to be lots of legal challenges, but if we lose the legal challenges, it doesn't matter because we can just say, those wicked lefty lawyers like Keir Starmer, they're getting in the way of what the people want, rah, rah, us. And that has kind of worked in the past. That was very effective with Brexit voters. But I don't think it's working this time. I think two things are happening. One is public opinion is moving. That policy was very popular when it was announced back in April, 48% support. That's now, JL and Partners polling had it at 35% support yesterday. So, that is dropping. And I'm thinking about why it's dropping. I was really struck. I was doing telly earlier this week with Craig McKinley, who's the MP for Thanet, kind of very Brexity kind of sort of Kent constituency that's very wound up about asylum seekers because they're coming into the Kent coast and, small boats across the channel and so on and so on. And he's absolutely sort of tub-thumpingly in favour of this sort of thing. And he doesn't really want to see. He's starting to have second thoughts about the whole flights to Rwanda thing, because it's not working. Basically, what you've got to tell your constituents is an empty plane sitting on the tarmac, and no matter what the sort of language is about, oh, you're having this great fight with the European courts, nothing is actually happening. What his constituents want to see, I mean, his constituents literally want to see the army on the beaches, you know, or kind of, but they want to see some kind of what looks like action, and what they're getting is talk, and they're not happy with it. And actually, I think it is starting to dawn on some Tory MPs that the sight of the government sort of performatively banging its head against a brick wall isn't really cutting it anymore. And there's that sense coming through that Boris Johnson says things and says he'll do things, and there's a lot of noise and drama, and at the end of it, you kind of look around you and what have you got exactly? Nothing has actively changed, and meanwhile, Nigel Farage is making hay with it. So
can I just say though,
worked as it did.
I do think that the Rwanda policy doesn't fit directly in with that. I think the sort of Northern Irish thing, the Northern Irish thing protocol fits more in with that analysis, is that he promises so much and actually doesn't deliver. I think the Rwanda thing is a slight anomaly in that it's been a problem since I was in the Home Office, you know, 2018, since Amber Rudd was in the Home Office. And so this is a cumulative impact of that problem getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I totally take Craig's point, and it actually surprises me that, you know, he's in that position now. But I think the Northern Irish protocol is much more indicative of the fact that Boris is trying to rally his troops and go back to that expansion of the Overton window, where he's basically trying to prove, I'm still an electoral winner. You know, going back to your original question, what are they trying to do to shore up support? Trying to say, look at me, I'm an electoral winner. Remember how I got all these people to back me in 2019, which, I mean, let's face it, was incredible. That was an incredible election victory. And I think he's trying to get people to revive that view and that sense of him.
Well,
I do think there's the same problem between on both fronts, between the Rwanda and the protocol policy, which again is that sense of they're both performative battles.
Yeah.
They both tie you up in lots of legal action. They're both not substantively changing I mean, what's happened on the protocol, the business with the protocol isn't just a sort of, you know, rah, let me show you what I'm doing about Brexit. It is solving a practical problem, or trying to solve a practical problem, which is that the Northern Ireland Assembly is not, you know, Stormont is not sitting. There's no functioning government in Northern Ireland. That's a really dangerous position really to be in. You know, you can't expect people in Northern Ireland to kind of do without a functioning government. And so if you want, you know, if their thinking is, well, to get the DUP back to the table, we have to give them something on the protocol, and we have to look like we're ripping up the protocol, so this is solving the problem. They are attempting to solve the problem, but again, it's not even clear that they've done what the DUP wanted, and it's not even clear that they're getting what they wanted back from the DUP. You know, I assumed a sort of deal had been stitched up where they'd said, what do we need to put in this bill to make you happy? And the DUP had said X, Y, Z, and they've gone, right, here's X, Y, Z, and then the deal would be the DUP would come happily back. But it doesn't even seem that thought through. You know?
Well, can I ask you about the other kind of slightly rabbit out of a hat, not a very welcome rabbit perhaps this week, which is the resignation of Lord Geit. And Gaby, you've written your column for The Guardian about it tomorrow, which is an excellent column, having had a preview of it. But you talk about it sitting as part of what you call a genuinely thuggish approach to adversity from Boris Johnson. Can you say how you see the Lord Geit story, this resignation and the events that led up to it? Does it feel like it's a completely separate thing to these other issues? How does it connect?
I mean, it's fascinating because we don't actually know. I think we probably know about 30% of the Lord Geit story now, because the version that we've got so far is, you know, the Prime Minister's independent advisor on ministerial interests resigned because he was asked to do something that he regarded as, or to approve something that he regarded as a breach of the ministerial code. And Boris Johnson has basically responded by saying, well, I'm sorry you feel that way about fill-in name of really boring argument about steel tariffs to do with WTO rules. Everyone's looking at it going, how do these two match up?
Yeah, I think a lot of people stop paying attention at steel tariffs, by the way.
It's like, which is of course the point of making about steel tariffs. But you look at the language in Geit's letter, you know, he talks about being put in an impossible and odious position. He talks about being asked to do something that is an affront. Geit is a former royal courtier with a background in military intelligence. He's not, you know, he's the most boring person on earth normally. You know, he gave evidence to a select committee this week and, you know, practically put the entirety of Parliament to sleep. He's not the sort of person who says those kind of things. about some, kind of weird, ill, boring squabble about trade rules. So it feels like we don't know what's happened here, but something has happened here that he really, really, really felt was wrong, or somehow feels almost morally injured by. So we don't know what that is, but we know it was something that broke that in his view, broke the ministerial code. And you have this pattern emerging whereby if there's a rule that restricts what government wants to do, then instead of doing what sort of conventional governments do, which is kind of moan about it, but then try and find a way around it, or think, well, we can't do that, so that avenue is closed off, so what can we do instead? This government just goes, oh, bugger it. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled against us, so we'll either threaten to leave the ECHR, although we're obviously not going to do that because it's mad, or we'll brief the Daily Mail that we're just going to ignore the ruling anyway, or, the Archbishop of Canterbury says our policy is ungodly, so instead of doing what Tory governments usually do when they're criticised by the church, which happens all the time, which is to say, a period of silence from, the bishops would be welcome, somebody goes around briefing that the bishops are going to be kicked out of the House of Lords. It's as if there's a kind of any scrutiny is resented, or any check on its power is resented. And I don't want to get too dramatic about that, because we're not, not living in Putin's Russia. We're living in a functioning democracy. But it's nasty. There's an edge to it. It's not a nice way of conducting yourself in public life. And there's an underlying attitude which is kind of, you don't have the right to stop me doing what I want to do. And actually, we do. Government is subject to checks and balances. You are subject to the law like everyone else. You are subject to scrutiny like everyone else. People, members of civil society, are entitled to have an opinion about what you're doing, even if you think it's wrong. You don't immediately leap to the sort of nuclear option every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to slightly pivot, we actually sent out asks to our readers of First Edition in our newsletters for the past few days, asking them to send us questions that they would love to ask Gaby and Salma. So to kind of segue to the first question, Neve has asked, has anything changed in the way that Number 10 operates since Dominic Cummings left? So Gaby or Salma, do you want to start off with that, and we can move to Gaby afterwards?
So, it's always quite difficult, because unless you've been in Number 10 at that particular time, you don't always capture the significant nuances. From an external perspective, and from someone who deals with government a lot, the only thing that's changed is that actually, Dominic Cummings' pet projects, whether they were kind of like, sending satellites up into sky and doing the UK DARPA and all his kind of like weird things, they've all sort of fallen away, but the rest of the chaos remains.
Right.
And, actually it speaks to Gaby's earlier point, which is kind of this almost thuggish like attitude, right? Well, if I can't do it, then I'm just going to explode. I'd characterize it slightly differently, in that it's just this deeper sense of immaturity. And I think at least Cummings, even though he'd only been in government for 2 years in the Department for Education under Michael Gove, I'm assuming your viewers will know that about his career.
They're incredibly
history.
learned viewers, even though we've
exactly.
got no idea who they are. Really.
I assume so. But he'd done a bit of government, and there were lots of people around there who'd done a bit of government. And sort of increasingly what's happened is that those people have been taken out and replaced for more people who haven't done government at all. And so there's this huge immaturity that you think, like from the outside coming in, that you get in and you go, oh yeah, like people are just supposed to do what I say because my boss is democratically elected, and it doesn't work like that. So I do think that increase in immaturity is probably the net result of all these new iterations of Number 10.
Well, actually that fits quite neatly into the next question, which is one that is from Rohan, but is also definitely a question that I've found endlessly surprising. Well, not surprising, but disappointing over the last little while, which is whether there is any prospect of a cabinet minister, as various backbenchers have demanded, taking a step in order to sort of change the calculus here. I suppose if that was going to happen, maybe it would have happened already, but is your sense that they are altogether mostly still behind Johnson in private? And if one of them were to make a move, who would it be? Gaby, sorry, I should very much specify. I'm very new to this. Apologies.
We live in hope, obviously, of a cabinet resignation that's all very exciting and gets us all kind of wound up. But arguably, the moment to do that was, around the last confidence vote. There are certainly people on whom you might be keeping an eye. There are certainly, it was never going to be the person who resigns in that circumstance is rarely the person who's actually going to run themselves. It's usually their best friend or someone who's convenient, who's happy to sort of lay down their cabinet career, so they're like a little rug for their friend to walk over. I think a lot of people had their eye for a while on Rishi Sunak simply because he was the person with least to lose in a way. I mean, he could go and have a jolly nice life in California, really, and leave all of this behind him and not ever have to answer any questions again about Partygate. And, would he just want to step away? But I interviewed him a few days ago, and it doesn't seem to me like a person who's totally got his feet up, I have to say. It's hard to tell. I mean, every time we say, we think someone's on the brink, they manage to stick with where they are. And it feels to me like those who are with him now are kind of in it. You've got this far, you've waded this far through the mud. What would you be? You'd only be resigning now out of sheer exasperation because there's not a sort of, there may be, you could only have another vote of confidence and therefore a leadership challenge if there was a rule change, which is not impossible. You could get the 22 committees to change the rules, but we're running out of time to do that. If you wanted to have a leadership campaign over summer, which is when would be the obvious time to hold it without getting in the way of government business, then, we've really not got much time. If he's safe by the end of July, that opportunity's gone. So it's not the time for a sort of strategically organised resignation, but it's time for somebody just going, oh God, I can't be doing with this.
Sorry, I can't
and
do
I'm not
it
quite
anymore.
sure who that person is in the current cabinet.
Salma, I mean, did you think that would happen? Are you surprised that they haven't, or is this just predictable course of events?
No, I'm not surprised. And, I often fell into the delusion about, he who wields the knife never wears the crown, the old Heseltine thing, that he was the one that sort of stood against Margaret Thatcher and then didn't end up doing it. And yet, funnily enough, most of the time, when there is some kind of challenge, it does actually end up going quite well. Margaret Thatcher challenged Heath, admittedly in opposition, and got the leadership secured in 75. Boris Johnson famously stuck it into Theresa May and, arguably became successful as a result of that. And a slight sort of different version of it was when Michael Gove turned on Boris Johnson and prevented him from becoming Prime Minister the first time. So there is kind of form, both ways for it to be helpful to your leadership ambitions. I think the problem is, there's not a lot of depth to the current cabinet. And I mean that in the sense of there isn't a lot of experience, and a lot of them are very, very, very loyal to the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And everyone else is sort of medium. Right, there isn't anybody really there who's going to pose an incredible challenge to him, and I think that is by design. So how much credibility, how much store should we put on a cabinet resignation anyway in these circumstances? Because they're not what you would describe as big beasts or what big beasts have been previously.
The worst thing would be if you resigned and nobody noticed, wouldn't it? Like a sort of minor cabinet minister resigned and everyone was like, yeah, well.
I mean, it is possible. Just to say, we are told that there is a bit of an audio lag, so if our mouths aren't matching up with our words, it's not that we're drunk, but apologies, and we're working hard behind the scenes to fix that.
Yeah, and as we're doing that, we're going to move on to the second section, and hopefully eventually the sound will catch up with our mouths. So those are some great questions from our readers. So that's the view from inside Downing Street. Now we're going to talk about Conservative MPs, as if we haven't already been doing that for half an hour. So all eyes have obviously been on the mood among the backbench MPs, especially after that, the vote of no confidence. Gaby, 2 weeks later or a week and a half later, could you tell me what the mood is like currently? There's obviously been a huge amount of upheaval and stuff, and there's the sticking point that there's, like we just said, no clear person to rally around, but is that changing, or are people just organising in different ways?
I mean, it changes day by day, and I don't know what the overall effect of the GITE thing is going to be. I think people are waiting to see what comes out of that. I think, I mean, when you say it's people organising, I think half the problem is they weren't even organising before when they were meant to be organising a leadership challenge. You know, it was all a bit sort of, there wasn't that feeling that somebody is orchestrating a trickle out of letters day by day and they knows exactly when they'll hit the 52 and they know they've got a spreadsheet of who their people are. You know, it was a mixture of some organisation and lots of people just randomly going, oh, so, you know, I can't be doing this anymore, and cracking over something unexpected. So if it wasn't particularly organised that time, it's even less organised now. I think I'm surprised in a way by how quickly things have just sort of settled down into a sort of resignation. You tried that, didn't work. You can't come back again, you know, 5 minutes later. So that's sort of settled for a while. We'll see where we are the other side of the by-elections. It feels like we're in a holding pattern now. If anything, actually, this week, and it's been fascinating to watch, you know, you'd think this would have been a bad week for Boris Johnson. What have we mostly been talking about until the Great Resignation? Is Keir Starmer boring or not? And, you know, his own shadow cabinet ministers popping up and saying he's boring everyone to tears, and then Keir Starmer having to tell everyone to stop telling people he's boring, and then trying to be not boring at Prime Minister's question and managing to be even more boring. And it just kind of, you know, it actually...
It was so painful, so painful.
It's like, don't make Star Wars jokes, that's not how to be interesting. But that's the boring person's idea of interesting. But you know, so we've somehow ended up in this position where, and it's a lot to do with their not knowing whether he might get fined by Durham Police or whatever, and people thinking, well, there's just a chance, you know, let me just get my name up there in lights. But you've actually had this weird sort of period of you know, kind of questions about the Labour leadership, which has allowed the Tories to sit back a bit and regroup and kind of, you know, and Boris Johnson to have a bit of an easier time of it at PMQs and so on. So I just, you know, never predict how this ridiculous parliament is going to turn out, because whatever you say, it's bearing no resemblance to to previous patterns, I would say, and is not operating on a great deal of logic.
Do you know what's interesting actually about that, Gaby? Sorry to butt into your questions, but you know what was fascinating about the ERG being super organised in order to bring down Theresa, that it was never about the person, it was always about the issue, right?
Yeah.
And I think slightly, and even to some extent with Corbyn, it was more about the issues and the ideal, because, you know, Jeremy was brought in because he was much more palatable than John McDonnell to a certain extent when he actually stood in that leadership contest that sort of propelled him to the top. But it's funny, actually, people are much better organised when they organise themselves around issues rather than a person. I think this is the problem with the Labour front bench at the moment, because they're trying to make it about Keir, and really they need to be attacking the Tories on issues, which they sort of do, you know, occasionally they land a blow. But for the Conservative front bench, it's definitely problematic, because they keep thinking, oh, is it this person or is it this person? Whereas actually your position on an issue and your ideological position is actually effectively going to be a lot more consistent. And I think that's what they're missing on both sides, the issues.
So does that have an effect? I mean, one of the things I've been wondering about with this is to what extent the people who've opposed him and are now looking at the stuff that has emerged over the last week or so are thinking about him as a sort of a personal and potentially unpalatable character, but also how much they are swayed by thinking about their prospects in their own seats. And I wonder whether you think there are people who might lose their seats who haven't yet jumped into opposition to him, if you see what I mean. Is there still a sort of a space there for him to try to persuade people that he is the most electable candidate?
Up until the by-elections, yes. I mean, that's the hard measure that everyone's waiting for, isn't it? And very conveniently, you've got two by-elections in very, very different seats. You know, Wakefield is, okay, it used to be a Labour seat. You know, it should not be unwinnable for Labour in a midterm by-election at all. But it's a red wall seat. So if you're an MP in a red wall, you're looking at it thinking, well, you know, whatever the swing is in that seat, I apply it to my own seat. And that's a rough measure of how safe I am. Tiverton and Honiton's totally different, because in a normal circumstance, it would be a solid, safe, rural Tory seat, and now it looks like it could either go Lib Dem or go close enough to panic a lot of other Tories in safe rural seats. So, you know, there are going to be a lot of MPs hanging on for those two, thinking that is as good. You know, you can look at as many polls as you like, and you can make as many projections as you like, but that's reasonably good, hard evidence. But then you're back to the same question, which is, suppose they're bad enough to make a lot of Tory MPs who haven't previously thought, you know, this is we're in dangerous territory, think, oh, right, panic. you going to have another vote of no confidence like 3 weeks after the last one, or how is that going to work exactly? You know, the timing is not ideal, and if enough Tory MPs sort of panic en masse like lemmings, then it kind of really doesn't matter whether the timing's ordeal. You reach a sort of point of critical mass where things just flow from that. But it's quite awkward to see how this pans out. And I think if you're a Tory MP who hasn't realised by now that your seat is possibly in danger under Boris Johnson, you're not the sharpest necessarily, or you have a marginal seat and you're not yet thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm safe here.
Yeah.
You know, you're not the sharpest Tory MP I've ever encountered to start with. So I don't think it's like a massive surprise coming next week, really. Right. But someone might feel totally different.
No, I mean, as always, it's kind of annoying being on with you with stuff, Gaby, because I kind of agree with everything that you say, and then you just say it better than me as well. So I'm just going to take notes. I mean, I know we're not supposed to be allowed to do that, and I am technically the Tory on the panel, but
but you're the Tory who can be on the Guardian, which is always, you know, that means you're in trouble.
No, I did not see this in my future many moons ago.
Fighting career development for all of us.
Just to say, we are hearing that the audio is fixed, so thanks for sticking with us, and apologies again. We're a work in progress. It's the first time we're doing this, so give us a little bit of leeway. So I guess the next question that I kind of had in mind is, you know, have the issues like the European Court of Human Rights and or the Northern Ireland Protocol, or, you know, has it helped to refocus the mind of backbenchers on the so-called dividing lines with Labour? You know, has this been a big shift? Salma, if you want to go first.
And I suppose, are they in particular thinking about it in opposition to Starmer and Labour, right? Like, are they able to focus on that enemy instead?
So I think it's difficult because there are so many different views. So to galvanise, you know, the approach that Number 10 has taken, and indeed the Foreign Secretary has taken, you would have to be sure that there are enough people. So I think this is something that is very much directed towards the Red Wall MPs, and obviously to the DUP, even though they're significantly diminished in number. I don't think it has really galvanised against Labour, because the arguments, because they're so sort of top line and aggressive, I don't see where the cut through is. I mean, it's actually quite a difficult technical. I mean, you were just talking about Lord Guyton steel tariffs. I have a lot of experience in steel tariffs, let me tell you, having dealt with Tata and the steelworks at Port Talbot. And it's kind of one of those things that when you actually get into it, there is a completely justifiable legal position that the government is taking on the fact that triggering Article 16 in the Northern Irish Protocol is something that you can do unilaterally because of the difficulties in getting goods across the border. It has now gone beyond that point of where you could have had a reasonable discussion about this with Article 16 because of all this kind of, you know, brinkmanship that's been happening and all this kind of language that Lord Frost has been bringing in. So there are lots of Conservatives, I think, that will welcome that because they're red wallers and they're still sort of clinging on to that Brexit victory. And there are lots of people who actually think that breaking international law because you just think it's all right and it's, you know, it's just going to get you over the line, makes us a laughing stock country. And if we do that, you know, I'm really surprised that Rishi Sunak isn't sort of intervening in this more, because our credibility as an investable nation completely diminishes. And so I don't think it is the galvanizing point. What I think is really interesting about the parliamentary setup is why Rachel Reeves isn't kicking us about it. And that's what I see as a much bigger weakness of Labour, because they could see this division and they're not really sort of thinking about the stakeholder groups that actually like business, that they should be appealing to at this point in the cycle, in the parliamentary cycle, in order to really make the Conservatives nervous about their position. So I don't see it as galvanising. I think the only people it should be galvanising are the opposition.
And Gaby, do you go on?
There's one way in which I think that has worked for him, actually, and it's been and you've seen it this week, is that Labour finds it very, very, very difficult still to talk about either Brexit or immigration. And, you know, those two things there's quite a long list now of things that the Labour Party has to tiptoe around a bit because it doesn't want, it doesn't want to talk about Brexit, it doesn't want to talk about immigration, it doesn't want to talk about strikes, it doesn't want to talk about trans rights. There's quite a long list of things that it doesn't want to go near, and some of them, I think it's probably right not to get drawn into culture wars that are just being whipped up in order to put it in a difficult position. But it's very hard to go into the next election without conveying some sense of how you feel about Brexit. And it's very hard to talk about the economy without being able to describe why there's this weird hole in the middle of it where all the trade used to be. And it's quite hard to, I think what it has done is reminded both Tory and Labour MPs that those are subjects on which the Labour Party is still vulnerable, and it still hasn't worked out how to talk about them, how to deal with them. It's a bit embarrassed by its inability to do them. And I think that's why I don't think the problem with Starmer is being a little bit boring. I think, given the sort of deranged kind of drama that we're getting from the other side, Jesus, I would take boring. Just some nice man in a cardigan who just doesn't break the law. Great, absolutely. But I think the problem isn't boredom. I think the problem is that Labour looks a little bit frightened and a little bit like it can't say what it thinks because it's worried that people won't agree with it. And that's not sort of decisive, that's not leaderly behaviour, whether or not they're right, actually, that they are on, about which side of the public divide they're on. You do have to look like you have convictions and you have courage in them. Even if people, I think voters respect that, even if they don't necessarily agree with your point of view, there are some issues on which they think, what he said really thinks, and I appreciate that.
Absolutely, and just kind of going off that very topic, Jules has asked, if the Prime Minister refuses to do the decent thing and resign, which is Jules's words, not mine, can the opposition parties end this death by 1,000 cuts by calling for a vote of no confidence in the government? What would that look like? It's
a procedural question for you.
I mean, they can. It would be totally pointless, but they can, because if if Boris Johnson is going to be deposed by his own side, he has a majority in Parliament. You are not going to get, there's not some way where the Labour Party can bring him down. It's for the Conservative Party to bring him down. And they don't seem inclined to do that at the moment. And in some ways, you see there is a school of thought that says Labour's standing back a little bit because actually it's quite not unhelpful to have Boris Johnson sort of still there, sort of, creating a news scandal every week. That's probably a bit more helpful to them than some sort of clean new character coming in and tidying up all the mess. So, but it's particularly the easiest way to stop a rebellion in a party is for the other side to look like it's driving it, to look like you're handing some kind of victory to Labour MPs by turning on your own Prime Minister. That's one of the strongest arguments for Tory MPs to stick with Boris Johnson in the vote of no confidence last week, even if they were really, really, really annoyed with him, is do you really want to be handing that to Labour right now, especially with a by-election coming up in a couple of weeks? Do you really want to be giving them a stick to beat us with all the way to the election? So it has to feel like it comes from inside the party. It can't be something that comes from outside. As to whether there's some other sort of mechanism by which he could be, forced out, short of him being arrested. I'm not really sure how that would work.
You'd probably be quite pleased.
Even then, dragged down the road like Mr. Toad, kind of protesting all the way. But yeah.
Salma, can you give Jules any more reason for optimism about anything that the opposition can do?
I'm afraid not, Jules. You're gonna have to wait this one out, like the rest of us, and see what happens. Like, I mean, we can get bogged down in that thing, and it's exactly what happened during Brexit, when it was unlike, oh, what amendments is Speaker Bercow going to allow into this bill in order to have, however many different iterations we were going to have of the Brexit bill, or how many kind of crazy procedural things you could challenge. And I can't remember, what was that one that was really famous for a bit in the House of Lords?
Thingy address? Something
yes.
address? I can't remember. I've got...
Bring it all back now.
Let's move swiftly on,
Never heard of that thing before. So I mean, you can basically get yourself bogged down in trying to find all these procedural things, and sort of the net result of it is very little. You need the fundamental shift. Either they're going to get rid of him, or they're not.
I mean, there is still, we should say, there's still the Privileges Committee investigation into whether or not, I mean, it's like, that whole thing about whether Boris Johnson lied to Parliament, I mean, that was ages ago, but there is still that investigation ongoing. And in theory, it could, find out that he misled Parliament, but there's a quite high hurdle to cross to prove that. And even if the committee decides that that's what happened, it doesn't necessarily it doesn't have teeth to do anything itself. So then you're into a whole new, I wouldn't necessarily rely on that as the sort of way out either. Well, on that cliffhanger, we're going to move away from Parliament and talk about Conservatives out in the country. So I thought a place to start thinking about this was just after the local elections, how extremely wounded many local Conservative leaders were and how much they blamed the Prime Minister and the Westminster Party for talking about the wrong subjects and for allowing the wrong issues to be the things that are being spoken about on the doorstep, not doorstop, that would be weird. So I'm just wondering, do you think that bond is broken in a kind of a permanent way? Can they be persuaded again that Johnson is the right leader? But also, what do they think when they hear the Central Party talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol and Rwanda, and they see Lord Geidt going? How does that influence the rank and file? And Salma, sorry, yeah.
So I think it's an interesting one because there's two competing feelings, I think, within the general network of the party, the rank and file. One is what we all have, and I'm a Conservative member. I am a member of Westminster, which has been particularly bruised recently through the loss of the council for the first time ever. So there's the side of us that will always have tribal loyalty to the Prime Minister because ultimately that is the person that is leading our party and through whichever mechanism has been elected to that. So, there is always a real difficulty to wrench yourself away from that person that you're literally card carrying, in order to support them and to work through and go out and be an activist and knock on door and do all those things that are really, really awful and actually really, really hard work. There's the other side of it, and this tends to be possibly a geographic split, probably more a generational split. There is some people in the older generation, I think, of the association who really dislike the party stuff, who really dislike, taking on the bishops because, it's quite faith, family, flag type environment. And so that does not sit well with them at all. And a lot of these people are local business people. A lot of these people are international business people. I mean, you can go to lots of Tory associations and see lots of people who've been very successful in their careers. So they know firsthand, what these policies that are coming out of government could potentially do to their businesses and what they would have done if they're retired. I think there's also that feeling amongst the professional party that were elected as councillors and things like that, that actually a lot of them could have held on to their seats if they just had that air cover from a Prime Minister that wasn't making self-inflicted errors. And so I think there's quite a bit of a split, but generally, even though people are annoyed and angry, there is very little that they can do. I don't even think it's like the old days where people are applying pressure to their local MPs to go and submit that letter, although I'm sure some of those conversations have happened in some of the bigger associations. But I think ultimately it's the same thing that happens in the parliamentary party, which is, the tribal loyalty to those people that you work with and that you volunteer with actually stands quite strongly in favour of Boris. And don't forget, he was their darling for a long time. And so it's quite hard to kind of, it's like a familial relationship that even if they annoy you and they've done something wrong, they're still yours. And it's a very strange thing, but all political parties generally are strange, aren't they? Why do I do it? I don't know. But you go and you have this belief and you have this community that grows up around you and you know people and you become friends and all that kind of stuff. And I think that is also important as well to the psyche of how you would then view what's going on right at the top.
Do you still feel that? Does he still feel like yours in that sense to you as a member of the party?
Yeah. I mean, it's odd, isn't it? But yes, because, he is the leader of the Conservative Party. We don't have another one. Nobody else is emerging. There's no one to sort of place a bet on. And, you know, there might be people that you think, oh, a future leader at some point, because, you know, any good organization's got a good succession plan, which actually in politics we've been struggling with in recent years. But, you know, if it was a fight between Keir and Boris, obviously I'm going to be in the blue corner. That's just a non-starter for me.
I mean, you just touched upon the next question that I wanted to ask you, but, you know, in terms of imagining a world beyond Boris Johnson, which at this point seems kind of impossible because he's everywhere, you know, do we have a sense of who that might be? As in, like, not a future leader, not someone who, you know, 5 years down the line is probably going to be ready to take that position, but someone who, if push comes to shove, will actually be able to take on that role and will be able to galvanise it, but not just Downing Street and not just, you know, Westminster, but also the country. Yeah, Salma or Gaby.
Gaby, let's hear from you on that one.
I'm interested to hear Gaby's views on this.
Oh, thanks for that one. Duck that one. I think half the reason we are where we are is that there isn't an obvious person. If there was a sort of, you know, obvious person rising majestically from the audience to kind of claim the crown, then Boris Johnson would be history by now. You know, there are problems with everybody that you could think of. I mean, I think if we're talking about Boris Johnson being replaced this side of an election, what would you be looking for? You'd be looking for someone who can slot in very kind of easily at the last minute, because, you know, a year and a half away from an election, maybe, I don't know. So, you know, you are looking for someone who has the necessary gravitas and experience, but you're also looking for someone who isn't tainted by all of the sort of drama of the last few months. So that sort of means that you're looking for someone who both is and isn't a senior cabinet minister, which is an interesting combination to ask for in someone. You know, the person who comes up, who seems keenest for it is Jeremy Hunt, but putting Jeremy Hunt back on the ballot paper would be like, because he was the person that ended up in the runoff against Boris Johnson last time, would be like going back to the membership and saying, you're wrong, you got it wrong, choose again, we're going to keep doing this until you choose right. So that's not going to happen. You know, Rishi Sunak is somewhat damaged by events of the last few, whatever. I think it's when a party gets to that stage, and it really reminds me of sort of the end of Gordon Brown, when you just got to a stage where you've been in government so long that lots of good people have fallen along the wayside. They've been tripped up by scandals not of their making, or they've fallen out with somebody, or they've just kind of been worn down by the gradual slog of it. And you look around you and you think, well, who else is there? There isn't really. You just somehow seem to have exhausted your talent pipeline, and you seem to have exhausted your ideas. I mean, what I find more worrying than the lack of a candidate is the lack of a sense of, if there was a new Tory leader, what would they, apart from like not breaking the law, what is their pitch to the country? Is it, you know, it needs to be something more than I didn't get drunk during lockdown. It needs to be a sort of reinvention of the Conservative Party for a different time. You know, it's not 2015 anymore. It's not 2020 anymore. It's not, we're moving into the sort of post-Brexit era almost. What is that? I don't get a sense of this like new idea or new thoughts or new blood coming through. And it's when a party gets to that stage that it all feels a bit exhausted. That is much more indicative, I think, sometimes of losing an election than where you are in the polls.
Well, one kind of manifestation of that exhaustion, well, maybe you'll think, is it strikes me that a weird thing about the way the last few weeks have gone is that the government tried to announce what it would present as a pretty generous set of measures to help people with the cost of living, and weirdly, it slightly feels like it's its own new things on the grid. It's its own new policies and suggestions and interventions that are making it hard for that to be central to the way that people think about what the government is interested in. And I just wonder if you think they have done enough of a job of trying to demonstrate to people that they are really focused on the cost of living, and whether if you talk to voters or if you talk to local party members, you think they would have a sense of that being an issue that was right at the front of mind for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. Sorry, this is why we're new. I'm really sorry. I keep forgetting to ask a specific person.
We're too polite to interrupt each other. It's Salma's turn.
Salma, please.
Give that to me again. I'm not quite
well,
sure.
I guess I'm all of this stuff about weights and measures and everything else. You know, when there's a cost of living crisis on and it seems like that was going to be the only issue anybody is really going to care about, are they doing a good enough job of focusing on the thing that is going to matter most of all to voters?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's quite obvious, isn't it? That's why they're all trying to get rid of him. I mean, it's massively problematic, isn't it? Like, you know, we're all either being taxed too much or everything costs too much. You know, even I'm looking at my holiday thinking, better sort of think about how pricey my restaurants are going to be if I'm going out for a meal.
It won't happen. Don't worry, it won't happen because your flight will be cancelled, so you won't be going.
Oh yeah,
anyway.
exactly, exactly. You know, things are not going well, right? And it's this idea. It's almost that sort of journalist in Boris Johnson, isn't it? It's that kind of like, well, I'll throw some weights and measures guff, and it'll be fine. And it's really, really disappointing. That's not to say things aren't happening behind the scenes. I mean, you know, government is a huge structure, and it's not just the cabinet. Obviously, they make the decisions, but there's arm's length bodies. There's the Bank of England, even though that's not covering itself in glory at the moment. There are lots of institutions that are trying to balance and think about it. The problem is that there hasn't been that pivot to say, actually, we need to start thinking about this in emergency terms, because we are saying that inflation is going to fall away magically after reaching 11% towards the end of this year. Well, if we don't have a resolution in Ukraine, that is highly, highly unlikely to happen, because regardless of all the other stuff that's going on, that's the first immediate thing that's going to have to change, especially with rising food prices. And there doesn't seem to be this like tactical plan that's being announced. Everything is government by photograph or sort of niche headline. And I think the thing that's missing, which I don't know if somebody has articulated it internally, but it's not obvious externally, is like, what is the mission of this government? You know, I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago that said that, you know, one of the reasons actually that Boris will not survive and has kind of lost his luster is because he filled this Brexit-shaped hole in 2019, but you can't wedge him into the shape of the problem now. And I think, you know, I have a lot of faith in people like Rishi Sunak. I have a lot of faith in a lot of people in the backbenches, you know, Jeremy Hunt, but he needs to be in government in order to perform that job. So there are a lot of things that I think that actually the Prime Minister could take seriously and change around over the summer to show that he's getting a grip. I don't know what's preventing him from doing that.
I would only add to that, as usual, I agree with everything you just said, but I'd only add to that whereas government's not talking about cost of living, and it's astonishing given how much money they spent in the budget, 21 billion, and you don't even want any, you know, if I was a government, I'd want like massive credit for that. I would want to be talking about it 24/7. Otherwise, why would you spend all the money if no one even knows they're getting it? But Rishi Sunak is doing it. Rishi Sunak is doing a very quiet little under the radar tour, and he calls it Treasury Connect, and he goes to all sorts of places that just happen to be marginal seats and does little chats with people who ask him any question they like, and he talks about cost of living endlessly, and he plugs the money, and he does a great thing. And I went and watched one that he did in Darlington the other week, and he managed to see MPs, you know, in all the marginal seats around. He's making lots of mates. Lots of MPs who feel really grateful to Rishi Sunak coming to their constituency and talking about how much money is spending, interesting in the context of where we are with the leadership. But he's out there talking about it. But it feels like he's on his own. It's like as if government doesn't even want to mention it. And I cannot understand why you would give away a load of money and not want people to know you were doing it.
But his thing is niche, right?
Yeah.
So if he's speaking to his selectorate at the moment, and he at this point, he can't pivot to the electorate, otherwise he'll get slapped down by number 10 again. You know, you still have to sort of have some semblance that, you know, of suggesting that you are part of the team still. So it's not like he can just go out and do Treasury Connect, you know, with purely government resources. So it's all slightly, you're right, it's all slightly under the radar. And it is about Rishi, it's not about the government. See, a smart strategic government would say, every department, go and talk about how much money you're putting out there. Go and do it.
Guys, we've got a couple more questions from readers if you've got time, and then we will abandon ship. But thank you so much for this. But Nimo, do you want to go ahead with some of them?
Yeah, so Jed has asked is if there's a grassroots movement within the Conservative Party, you know, local, you know, people on the ground. Is there a grassroots movement to unseat Boris Johnson, or just to kind of, is there something happening outside of Westminster, outside of London, in terms of mobilising against Boris? To Salma.
No, not that I've come across, and I think that's largely because there isn't a mechanism to be able to really do that apart from register your annoyance within your association and to CCHQ, which is Conservative Central Headquarters, and to your local MP if they are Tory. So with a grassroots movement, what would they be campaigning for apart from just sort of reiterating the things that they're already saying elsewhere?
Should we just ask one more quick fire reader question, which is from Azzy, which is, does it help the candidates in these by-elections if the Prime Minister shows up? Is he any value to them on the campaign trail? Which I think is a very good question from Azzy. And Gaby.
If I was them, I'd be like begging him to stay away. I'd have Rishi come and talk about all the money that we're giving away. And I think probably that I'd be busy the day that Boris Johnson wanted to come if I was them.
You say that, but even now, he draws a crowd. And so logically, you'd have to look at the polling. Logically, I'm totally with you. I'd be like, no, thank you, bye-bye. But if you did it in kind of like a controlled explosion, where you just had sort of the right kind of people, and you just sort of plonked him in there, there's still like, a little bit, like an old showbiz hand that's sort of slightly aged and doesn't dance as well anymore, but still got the moves, can still do the old classics. A little bit like that. Maybe
that is a terrible image to leave us with. But last questions from you.
So, first of all, Salma and Gaby, thank you just so much for coming and taking your time to be here with us. But it also wouldn't be a political panel discussion without asking you some big questions and wild predictions about the future. So, rapid fire. Can we finish with quick answers to two big questions? Will Boris Johnson still be the Prime Minister by the end of the year? And who's going to win the next election? Salma, do you want to go first?
On the current trajectory, yes, he will be Prime Minister at the end of the year. And I think we are headed towards Conservatives' largest party, potentially needing to form a coalition.
And Gaby?
I want to say no to the Boris Johnson question, but that would be like heart-ruling head, probably, for all the reasons Salma said. I think at the moment, if it's not, it's going to be a mess, whether it's a Lab Lib Green SNP mess or a Conservative minority government mess, is harder to say, but I'm going to stick my neck out and say it's a Lab Lib SNP Green, anyone else who fancies it, mess.
All right. Well, thank you both again so much for being with us. It's been excellent talking to you, and thank you for making our First Edition Live run slightly smoother than it would have done without your incredibly smooth presences. Cheers. It was really fun to speak to you both. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for watching as well. If you enjoyed this live event, please do check out the Guardian Live programme by searching Guardian Live events and using the promo code First Edition for a £5 ticket to any of our online events in June and July. And please also subscribe to the YouTube channel, and really what I care about is please subscribe to the newsletter, theguardian.com/First Edition. And that's everything. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you and good night.